Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Monday, June 27th. We're continuing with our coverage and interviews with candidates who are running for statewide office around the state, running in the primary elections that will be held on August 9th. And today it's our great pleasure to welcome John Odum, who's currently the City Clerk of Montpelier, and one of three Democrats running in their party's primary to be their nominee for Secretary of State in the general election in November. Mr. Odum has served in that office in Montpelier since 2012, where he oversees local elections there, as well as other municipal affairs. Mr. Odum, thank you very much again for making the time for this conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I would mention that the other municipal affairs include things that are also functions really at the neighborhood level of the Secretary of State's office. We do licensing, we do archives. So, we have some experience at the neighbor-to-neighbor level with these sorts of things.
All right.
I should say.
Sounds like a basic town clerk job.
Yep.
Well, I guess let's just get started then with the obvious question. What prompted you to throw your hat in the ring this time around for the Secretary of State position?
Well, a few things. One is that town clerk experience with the office opening up. And generally, historically, you get somebody from outside the office every 10 years or so with a different perspective. You had Jim Condos 10 years ago, Deb Markowitz about 10 before that. I think the next good approach that will really bring a lot to the office would be bringing that neighbor-to-neighbor approach up to the level of the sort of top of the totem pole, if you will. I'm also a nationally recognized election cybersecurity expert, and we have done very well in Vermont under the current paradigm, but I think things are getting more serious, and I think it's time to change that paradigm, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about that. Also, I'd like to see the office be leveraged a bit more to really talk about values and promote our values, such as anti-racism values, that sort of thing, through the Office of Professional Regulation. I think that's an extraordinary opportunity there to reach out to businesses and, professional licensees out there. And, there's a couple other things, voting, expanding opportunities for voting and making voting, I think, more reflective of our communities. I'd like to talk about ranked choice voting. It's something I think the Secretary of State's office could go on tour with. We could bring together folks who are voters, folks who are advocates, folks from Maine, clerks from Maine, where they've been doing this for a while, our local clerks as election administrators, and see if we can't finally call that question around the state and bring that conversation around. I also spearheaded non-citizen voting, the effort on that in Vermont. We got it going in Montpelier, and shortly after that, I was contacted by the Winooski City Clerk, City Council, actually, to help them get started. And that sort of thing, 16 to 17-year-old voting, other creative ways to expand the franchise in local communities, I think only enhances the culture of democracy, even for those elections where folks like that would not be able to vote. And I think the Secretary of State's office, which took kind of a hands-off approach to it when we were talking about it, which I'm not critical of, I understand. I got sued by the Republican National Committee on this very issue, so I can understand not wanting to put yourself as a target. But I still think the Secretary of State could really be supportive of those kind of efforts and step into the conversation a bit.
I think it'd be reasonably fair to say that up until 2020, the post of Secretary of State was probably seen as sort of one of the sort of kind of a sleepier backwater of state government. Not that there's anything bad about that, but after the uproar over the 2020 presidential election results and the ongoing issues around that, culminating in the January 6th event in Washington, election balloting and counting votes obviously kind of leapt to another level altogether. And I guess I just wondered, Is it a real concern that there is actual voter fraud, or that election results could be miscounted or misreported? Is that a real problem, or is that just something that's been just made up to
You
censor?
know, clerks are election administrators, as you say. We have a real investment, hands-on in our communities doing that work. We're the ones who are going to be aware of things like this, first and foremost, if there's fraud. And you get a balance there. If you change the laws to cut down on fraud, you start affecting voter participation. And likewise. So the question is, where are we at? What do we need to do? Well, that balance is completely skewed against voter participation because there's virtually no fraud out there. In fact, if there were, the clerks would be the first, myself, I'd be the first person stepping up and say, look, we have an issue. But right now, that's not where the balance is. It's not a concern. We're doing well in Vermont. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We've got a good system. And if anything, we need to work on that balance by finding more ways to increase voter participation. Fraud is not our concern right now. Getting people out to vote, people having confidence in our election system, that's the concern.
So how do we go about making a turnout better, or primary and general election voting easier and simpler for people who, well, one of the common complaints I've heard is that, a lot of people have to work that day, or they have childcare responsibilities. And they just aren't able to kind of get to their town hall to get a absentee ballot. What could we do to make voting simpler so that we would have election turnout that's more in the 70, 80, 90% range, rather than being happy that we get, oh wow, 50 or 60% of the voters turned out? Isn't that great? And in other countries, that would be considered terrible.
Yeah. Well, there's several things we could do. I mean, you hear a lot about making Election Day a holiday, and that just seems like a no-brainer. Having said that, that becomes less and less important as we really push early voting, where it becomes less about an election day and more like an election season, which I think is a terrific thing that's begun to happen. The mail-in voting obviously was a big plus, and I am completely in favor of expanding it to all elections, including our August primaries, which, those are the complicated elections where you get so many ballots, you pick one, you put the other two in the ballot, they have to come back together. I think that needs to be simplified. I think if mail-in elections are going to work, that process needs to be simplified. I think as I was saying before, with creative ways to expand the franchise, I think that creates a culture of democratic engagement, or increases the culture of democratic engagement that goes, right up to those, to the top, to the elections national, to the elections state. So much of that attitude starts at the local level. It really is about the local level. So I think you work on that. And again, at the local level, I'd be in favor of expanding non-citizen voting, 16 to 17-year-old voting. There's a lot of things we can do. In my office, we open up, although not since COVID, but we're going to start it again. We open up for Saturday voting. And that's been an enormous success, and it's clearly impacted turnout. So, these are some of the things we can do. There's plenty more.
Well, let's talk about ranked choice voting. It's been something I've been kind of reading a lot more about lately. Sounds like a very interesting concept, although one that also would seem to take us into a more complex direction. But let me have you explain to us what exactly is ranked choice voting?
Well, there's a few different kinds of ranked choice voting. At its most basic, at the sort of instant runoff voting level, you're ranking your choices in order. This is my first choice for the office. This is my second choice. This is my third choice. If nobody gets it, those first choices, there's no 50%, then you start sort of trimming it down. You take those bottom choices, the ones that came in last, and you drop them off. And then those people who voted for them number one, their number twos get added to the top. So then you check again, is it 50% yet? If not, you keep going. And the idea is you get a better picture of what people actually want in a community. And I think that's demonstrably true. I think it has some great side effects too, because you don't want to alienate possible number two voters or folks who will choose you as their second choice in an election. So what does that mean? It means people are going to be a lot nicer. A lot of this vitriol, a lot of this nastiness, which is spreading more and more around the country. And, we're not an island here. It's going to come here. You see that kind of cut off because you don't want to alienate other voters. So, that's basically how it works. I am supportive of it. I'll tell you, it's been a process for me. Before I was clerk, I was involved in a lot of nonprofit work, a lot of electoral politics. So the idealist in me was always all for it. I became an election administrator as a clerk, and I got very uncertain. I started imagining things like a hand recount with instant runoff voting. It did not sound like a good idea to me. So having said that, I had to have that conversation with myself. And clearly, it's the right thing to do. It's the right approach. There is software out there already that counts under ranked choice voting. It doesn't have to be difficult. It's done in Maine. It's been successful in Maine. So we wouldn't even be stepping out as some kind of pioneer into unknown territory.
Is this something you think should be adopted statewide, universally in one throw if we decide to go in that direction? Or should these be decisions that would be made community by community?
Well, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Having said that, I think at the community level, it makes a lot of sense to have that choice when you're talking town meeting day, just like you have that choice, theoretically have that choice, should folks want it, for non-citizen voting. But, statewide, national, yeah, as I say, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I'd like to see it. I think we're probably just talking statewide, but every election we could. And, if we can bring in federal, like I say, it's either a good system or it's not. It's a good system. It's a good system at every level.
Let me turn to that question then about voting by folks under 18 and non-citizens. I'm assuming this would apply only in strictly local elections, like for select board, school board members, things like that, as opposed to statewide races such as the one you're in.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, statewide, you couldn't do it at the statewide level because it's unconstitutional under the Vermont Constitution, statewide level. It's unconstitutional also for the federal level. But the local level, municipalities, we're what's called a Dillon's Rule state, which means municipalities are effectively jurisdictions of the state. So the state can allow towns to conduct their own business however they choose. There's nothing stopping them under the Constitution. And that was the big argument we had in the legislature. And that was the one we brought out constitutional experts, and it was unanimous. It was complete consensus. This is completely constitutional. So it was an interesting discussion up there, I tell you.
So I wanted to ask you about your background then in information technology or IT. How would you plan to apply that background and expertise in the Secretary of State job if you're elected to it?
Well, I've got a pretty good perspective on the issue. Certified ethical hacker is a professional credential for penetration testing. We're the people who come in and try to bang on the walls from the outside and then let folks know where the holes are. In that capacity, I'm on the advisory board of the Cyber Policy Initiative at the University of Chicago. I have been involved in the hacking conference, the International Hacking Conference, where voting machines are hacked into to determine their weaknesses. So this whole perspective makes me very aware of our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses. As I say, Vermont has done a great job, but the current model is just not going to be adequate anymore, especially with the war in Ukraine. This stuff is amping right back up again. We're already seeing it. It's going to be the #1 problem again, over disinformation. So what I'd like to see right now, we contract essentially our election management and the management of our voter lists to a third-party company. They're opaque. You want to try to figure out who they are, good luck. They also They own the market. There's very few of them. They're expensive, and a lot of them have security problems. So I would like to see us dump that whole process and work on what's called open source technology. There's plenty of open source out there that's been approved by Homeland Security. Open source is collaborative. It's not corporate. It brings experts together in an expert community. They are constantly working to improve it, constantly working to enhance the security. It is simply a more secure model. It puts us less, not so much in the hands of corporation. It gives us control over our own destiny in so many ways. I think you add that to the idea that you need a dedicated network for all the town clerks, because right now we interface directly with the voter rolls and the election management through our browsers, and we're using the computers we use for, Facebook, for email. That's not good. We need dedicated computers in a dedicated network, because 95% of hacks come from things like viruses or old, unpatched, unupdated software. So we have a network that manages the software. We have a network that keeps stuff, that keeps the viruses out, because we're all controlled as election administrators from being sloppy or putting it in danger.
What do you think we could do to either alter the format of town meeting or do something to encourage more attendance at those information meetings, which occasionally double as the full-blown town meeting? That's where the voting will take place. And sometimes they're separated into two things. But how do we get more people to turn out and get involved in just being involved in their local affairs?
Well, obviously, if we move to universal ranked choice, then that would be an issue for town meeting, which is why, I think there needs to be a certain degree of local decision to go that route, because you're really up against the wall with town meeting. You've hit a lot of the limits of the democratic process with town meeting. And I'd like to say otherwise, but I think you look at it from every angle, you come back to that. Having said that, there are certainly some things that could be done. You could expand that holiday idea quite a bit more. Representative town meeting has been successful in Brattleboro, and that makes it into a bit of a hybrid. And again, that local democracy issue where you could invite in 16, 17-year-olds, again, to bring more folks in, again, to enhance that local culture of, democracy is really a part of who we are. But having said all that, that is frittering around the edges. And I think it's time in some cases for some communities to make the hard decision like larger communities already have. We don't have town meeting in Montpelier because you're getting up against that wall with turnout, a structural challenge that is only going to be, so manageable.
So in addition to overseeing elections and related things like that, some of the other responsibilities of Secretary of State's office include managing exemptions to public records. What records can be made public, I guess. And I was rather surprised to find out there were, I guess, more than 260 exemptions to Vermont's Public Record Act that government agencies have to keep track of. I guess I just was wondering, would you support reducing the number of exemptions to the state's public records requirements?
Oh, the public records law. There are hundreds of exemptions, which means, to my mind, that means it's broken. So I think we need to redo it from the bottom up. I think there are ways we could do it better from the bottom up. It's structured more as freedom of documentation than freedom of information. I think, bringing it a little more modern like that. I think having an ombudsman position at the Secretary of State's office to really help folks move through the law and understand it would be enormously helpful. I think that's pretty universally held with my opponents too. But yeah, I think bottom up. I think an ombudsman would help folks access it. I think a sort of broader sense of what the law is meant to access. And it is true, sometimes it is weaponized for just for mischief making. which is a disservice to folks who actually really need to use that. So we need to look at see if that's manageable too, and it may not be without losing some of the, that quality, the openness, the transparency that we need to be. But at least it's a conversation we should have.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about was how the state's open meeting law is working. I remember hearing a controversy a few years ago about how certain select board members would text each other during a meeting saying, "Hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that?" And there's some question as to whether or not that was in keeping with the full spirit of transparency or open meeting. And I guess I just wondered if you thought, well, A, what do you think about that in particular? And then B, in general, is the state's open meeting law kind of working as well as it's, likely to ever work, or has worked in the past? Or if not, what changes do you think might be appropriate to be made at this point?
I think the open meeting part of the law is actually working fairly well. The texting issue, I don't know if you're referring to Montpelier, but it certainly happened here, I think about 12 years ago. And the fact that those folks did get in trouble for it suggests that it's not a loophole, right? That loophole was closed. They hit that closed wall. So I think that's a good sign for that. I think it's working reasonably well. I think some specificity and clarity on what's considered, for example, adequate time for the public to speak, for individuals to speak. Clarity is always helpful, and it's nice if you don't have to leave really establishing clarity on these things just to the courts, because it's really problematic for a lot of folks to take these things to the courts. So generally, I think it's working well. More specificity would be helpful.
Another area the Secretary of State's office handles is business regulation and licensing. Any thoughts there? Do you feel that the process now is either too sluggish and takes, just discourages people from wanting to start their own business or go for a professional license of some sort? I'm not aware of any major concerns around that, but it's quite possible that, since I haven't had to apply for a license or a business of any sort, and recently I've missed something, but what, if any, changes would you make to that area of the operation if you wind up being elected in November?
Well, I think in general, I'm going to say I think Jim Condos and Chris Winters, who's a major part of that operation, have done a really good job. I've certainly heard a few licensed professionals, tell me they'd like to be a little more directly involved in how the system works. So, and that's probably always something you can do. So I keep my ears open to that. The main thing that I'm talking about with OPR is the idea that it is an extraordinary, unique conduit to small businesses, licensed professionals out in the state. This is a huge amount of people. And I think the opportunity is there to work on professional development, which I've heard from folks would be helpful because of that communication and that opportunity. But honestly, I'd like to see it more of a conduit for values too. We have concerns in this state about racism, about sexism. Imagine for a minute if you put out onto that network from that hub that's the Secretary of State's office, send it out to the spokes, an explanation, encouragement to sign up for the Equal Pay Compact. You could quadruple that in no time, if not more. You could send out information, create some basic online professional development around anti-racism. Push out information on that, encourage folks to use it, communicate on that. Folks who do use it, do take advantage of it, could then be lauded by the Secretary of State. They could be put on the website as, good corporate, good business citizens who have done this process. They could be included in a press conference. Climate pledges. There's just all kinds of ways we could utilize this as a network and really bring in and, coordinate the business, licensee network on really creating the culture we want to see in the state.
And just kind of one last question before we have to run here. I've wondered, particularly in the last 2 years or so since the arrival of the pandemic and the arrival of hybrid meetings and online meetings, if we clearly see some towns have adopted hybrid meetings as kind of a pretty standard way of going, and I've seen greater local participation or people attending, quote unquote, from home. And I just wondered, are there any guidelines or restrictions you feel, while on the one hand that may be great, it makes things a lot more convenient and easier for people to attend meetings, particularly during parts of the year when the weather isn't so great. But are there any restrictions or guidelines that perhaps boards who are contemplating going into a hybrid format away from the traditional in-person meeting at the town hall, what they should be aware of or be thinking about?
I think the way the law was structured is actually pretty good. There's that requirement that if it's a hybrid meeting, it needs to be recorded. I think that covers a lot there. And, I tell you, since we've been able to do this, we've always had concerns over, getting a quorum for my Board of Civil Authority meetings, my Board of Abatement meetings. We don't have those concerns anymore. There's a lot of pressure off me and my chairs. So right at this point, I got nothing but praise for that process. I'd like to see it continue.
And I was also, kind of also wondered, what about voting? I was thinking, gee, could this be extended to like the full-blown town meeting in some way or another, and have citizens vote, but vote electronically or remotely on a floor vote, but be at home?
Electronic voting is extremely problematic. I think the sort of obvious reasons when you're talking, a Zoom type situation is that it may not be reliable. But you hear, or it's hackable too. You have, what you call Zoom bombing, where people come in. We've had that happen at city council meetings. Now, broadly speaking, if you're talking about something like internet voting or email voting, highly problematic. You've got more than literally 2 billion Android devices in the world compromised with malware. So it doesn't necessarily matter how good your connection, how safe your connection is to the to the tabulator. If your unit, if the system you're working from, your computer, your smartphone, your tablet, if it's compromised, then your vote is compromised. And we just don't have enough security now to be sure that people's home devices do not get compromised. And quite frankly, a lot of us think we never will. So I'm not a fan of that type of voting whatsoever.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there for today, but thank you again, Mr. Odum. I really appreciate your time. Again, for folks watching, the primary is coming up on August 9th, although I believe early voting is now already underway, so that you can go down to the town hall and get your ballot or whatever. Well, we'll see what happens. Again, Mr. Odum, Montpelier City Clerk, thank you very much for your time, and well, good luck out there on the campaign trail.
Oh, thank you. This has been my absolute pleasure.
Perhaps we'll have another opportunity to talk again after the primary.
It's good to me.
All right. Take care, and thank you very much. I hope you found our program interesting. We'll see you again the next time.